going to be introducing our panelists and the moderators. I'll turn it over so they can introduce themselves. But before I do that, I wanted to share talking about resources where some of these oral history resources will live. They're going to be all on a doc that we're going to share. But just so you know, it's going to eventually lead you to this page. This is the American Cultures Center website. Here's the website, americanculture.berkeley.edu. And we have a section for the High School Ethnic Studies Initiative here. And this is the page where you can find that video that we just watched. Trailer for the oral history project. Right now it has a few, but it's going to have a lot more of the oral histories that we conducted. It's going to have biographies on them, both 1969 TWLF and 1999. There's only a selected few, but there's going to be a lot more. And at the top, there's an oral histories topics tab. So when you click on this, it also shows some approaches if you want your students to have oral history assignments in class. These have been curated both by American Culture Center staff, the Ethnic Studies librarians. Sina has pointed out some great oral history toolkits from UC Irvine. And here are some projects, so you also get a sense of how some of these theories get implemented into some great works. And if you have any questions, just feel free to contact us. Now I'd like to introduce the panel. So first joining us is Clementina Duron. Clementina is a 1969 TWLF Student Striker, a UC Berkeley Alum, and a public school teacher and principal for 30 years in Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco Unified School Districts. Next, we have Vicci Wong, who is a 1969 TWLF UC Berkeley Student Striker, UC Berkeley Alum, the co-founder of Asian American Political Alliance, AAPA, and co-founder of the Salinas chapter of the United Farmworkers Union. And next we have Waldo Martin, who is the Alexander F. and May T. Morrison Professor of American History and Citizenship in the Department of History here at UC Berkeley, who specializes in social movements, especially Black Power movements. And lastly, we have Harvey, who is a 1969 TWLF UC Berkeley Student Striker, a UC Berkeley alum, and a co-founder, and a current faculty member in the Department of Ethnic Studies.
And then hi everyone again, my name is Ashley and I'm a program assistant with the American Culture Center.
And I'm Gregoria, and it's a real honor to be here. My grandmother was actually a Brown migrant staff member at Berkeley in the 1960s, and so she was on campus, but she passed away when I was 3, and so I don't know what her involvement was, if at all. But I feel very grateful and honored to be here with you all and Ashley.
To start us off, I'm wondering if you can tell us how you first learned about the 1969 Third World Liberation Front Coalition at UC Berkeley. If you were involved, what was your involvement?
Okay, hi everyone again. I'm really excited to be here. There's been presentations kind of in the past and I'm kind of on the shy side. And so I don't really like to present and talk about the past, but I really wanted to come today because it's about you, the current teachers, the people on the line right now. And it's just such a key, pivotal moment actually in history for our communities that I'm just very excited to be with you. And if you want to make any connections in the future, because I love education, I'm passionate about it. I haven't given it up too easily in retirement. I was a school board member here in Albany, and I have lots to say about that too, about the realities of today and how it's not so different than 53 years ago. But anyway, just to let you know that I'm open to whatever questions you have in particular. And I'm really proud to be on this panel. Vicci and I not only go way back then, I mean, honestly, after the strike, we never talked again until the reunion, which was about 3 years ago. So, we all went our own ways, but Vicci and I actually have even a deeper connection because we're both from Salinas. And I heard Vicci, organize the Farmworkers. That was me. I was in the fields actually picking the strawberries, and I didn't hear Vicci. Yeah, I didn't hear her, but anyway, so we have lots of deep connections actually, and we do get together from time to time today. Anyway, having said all that, and Harvey, I got together with Harvey too several years ago, and so one of the connections, one of the most key things about ethnic studies is solidarity. It truly is, and I felt that as a striker in 1969. I came from Salinas. I came from Catholic school for 12 years there, very isolated, very small-minded in terms of my environment. And then when I got here, I lived on North Side. I lived in a co-op on North Side. So I was still continued to be isolated because most of the action, of course, was down here, South Side, Telegraph, etc., right? And so it was one of the actual leaders of the strike, Isidro Macias, who lives in Hawaii, and you guys can always connect with him on Zoom if you want to do something, with him talking to your students. But anyway, so I don't remember how he and I got together, but he invited me to go to, at the time, MASC, Mexican American Student Committee had just changed over to MECHA. And I went to a few meetings, and then it was all about, are we gonna strike? And so it took me a little while to catch up, but we voted to strike. And we definitely started then in solidarity with other students of color on campus. I was really rank and file, meaning I was not in the leadership role. Vicci could talk more about that. But as a rank and file, I really was just there to support everything from going on the serpentine marches that we had all over campus, running from the blue meanies, giving little talks at my co-op and the other co-ops. I felt I needed to do that. Passing out leaflets here on Sprawl and Telegraph, trying to talk to the sororities and fraternities, the jocks, about not crossing our picket line. I mean, that was not ever, they did what they wanted to do. But in the end, the other thing was the solidarity, ultimately, that I didn't realize till much, much later, but there was solidarity with workers on campus, who came out. I mean, there were different reasons, of course, why they supported, us, because they also were getting bombarded indiscriminately with tear gas and that kind of thing. So they wanted that to be over with, right? But anyway, besides solidarity with people of color, which has carried me forward like forever until this day, the other is sort of a sense of the commonalities, the connections that you as teachers can make with your students day in and day out. I think that is so key. So, and also the sense of community, which I think many of our students come to school with already, but it gets plastered down, depending on what your schools and your school districts are like. So anyway, that's basically all I wanted to say, because I just want to talk about the kids and you and what you're doing. So Vicci, you want to talk about the past?
Yeah, I'm just briefly, because I really am anxious, especially to hear your questions and everything. I know we need to say something. Anyway, so I'm from Salinas, the salad bowl of the world. Most of your lettuce, strawberries come from there. And I grew up on a farm. We lost our farm early because we were a small farmer, and we grew green onions, which at the time was not really in people's diet. So, I mean, that went nowhere fast. I mean, you couldn't get green onions in Safeway back then. I mean, people didn't even know what green onions were. But anyway, so I became a farm worker when I was, a kid. And by the time I was 11 or so, I heard about Cesar Chavez organizing the Farmworkers Union, and I wondered why isn't there one in Salinas? And I didn't know that much about the valley. My cousins lived in Fresno, so once in a while when we had time and there wasn't any farm work that would be our vacation because we had no money. We'd be shuttled off to stay with my cousins in Fresno, and that's where I heard about, what was going on in Delano and other places like that. But so when I came back to Sweden, I said, man, we got to organize a Farmworkers Union here. Now, at that time, most of the Chicano workers were from Mexico in the Bracero program. So they weren't citizens, and they were shunted off into these shacks on the far side of town. I was 11 or 12. I didn't have a car. I barely spoke any Spanish. I could barely speak English, actually. I was sent to, you wouldn't believe it now, but I spoke with such a heavy accent. They sent me to, during my lunch hours, everybody laughed at me because I had to go to supposedly English classes to learn proper English to drill out any accent I had. So anyway, it was very limited, but I just felt, man, when I heard about the Farmworkers Union organized, I said, we got to do this here because, you can't believe what it was like, and you eat those strawberries, they're delicious, but you know how horrible it is to pick them? You have to bend way, way down, It's backbreaking work. The strawberries are really close to the ground. Lettuce, too, is also grown, low. So it's just 12, 14 hours, 6 days most of the time, sometimes 7 days a week. I worked after school, I had to go work. During weekends, I had to work, and I was mainly bunching onions, but I also picked strawberries, tomatoes, things like that. And it was, something that I learned so early that this is not right. I'm getting pennies. I literally would get, it was a good day if I made 99 cents that day. 99 cents working 12 to 14 hours. So I could only imagine what the great workers were going through as well. So anyway, my friends and I, and at that time, you have to understand, I was living in a black and white world. Before the World Liberation Front movement, and especially for Asian Americans, there was no term or concept of Asian American. At best, we were Orientals, but we just had our own, I was Chinese American, there were Japanese Americans there, and I always wondered why in school and just in life in general, I always kind of had an affinity for a person who kind of looked like me, and why my parents, who hated Japanese because of the war in China and Japanese imperialism, like my Filipino friends, we all hated Japanese. My father told me, you can't marry a Japanese, and all of this. But yet, whenever there was a movie with the Japanese in it, or a TV show, because at that time also, TV, movies, magazine ads, everything was black, mainly white, and the few people of color were either maids, servants, women were prostitutes, So the few times there even was a person of color, my parents would pack us up and we'd go see that movie, or we'd watch, a TV show, even with the Japanese portraying a Chinese servant, because that was still something. And I never understood I knew, okay, yeah, that's great to see somebody who kind of looks like me, but I never understood why it was that this was happening like this. And why, and so, anyway, this is all going on at the same time. Meanwhile, this is why you are so important. One of the persons who most influenced me was one of you, a high school teacher. That teacher had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era, and he had to teach gym for over 5 years, even though he was a history scholar. And so finally, when I got to high school, in 9th grade, he got back, he was able to teach history again. But they gave him the dummy classes, and I was like, it was part of the Dewey system of education reform, even though I was in a poor area and everything, they had designated us to be college track. So I was put in the college track program, and the history teacher there was this really conservative, unlikable guy, and I didn't want to take history with him. And I heard about Mr. Morgan, who was, had heard really good things about what a great teacher he was and how people really liked his classes. And I said, I'd rather go to his class. So I and a couple of my friends asked to be transferred, and they thought we were crazy, you know. But instead, he opened my eyes, and on my friends' eyes, we never wanted to miss a minute of class. That's the difference you make, you know, in what you do, whether you realize it or not. And the opposite is true too. I mean, I always think it should be a crime to make history boring. I mean, how can you make history boring? How can you make people toppling monarchies that have been in existence for centuries of years boring? How can that be? How can you put people to sleep like that? Anyway, to me, that's the crime. But anyway, so he was the opposite. He wasn't like a flamboyant teacher. He didn't, you know, dress him or yell or scream. He was very quiet, very dignified. But he told us, this is the main thing, he told us the truth. He dared to tell us the truth. That's why he got in trouble the first time. But that didn't stop him, and he came back. And this time he met some very receptive people, and me and my friends. Because I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him. I think I'm taking up most of my time. So I think I'm sorry to get off on a tangent, but I wanted to get that in first because I know how despairing it can be in any job, but especially your job. I was a teacher myself for a while, and I know how it can be just dealing with the students on every level. And then you got to deal with the parents, and then you got to deal with the administration and the bureaucracy, and then you got the political pressure. And in some ways, what you're facing is even worse than what we face. Because you would think we had progressed by now. Instead, you're getting back to more Yahoo Neanderthal. I think they even existed back then. I mean, so I, you know, whatever we can do to help you up, because you have to understand how what you do in that classroom and your interaction with the students can really change people's lives. And it will change them even if you're not conscious of it. Because even if you don't, you know, and they don't see it either. But what we're doing right now, you know what we're doing? We're making history. Because that's the other truth that we have to learn, that that's what our strike was about and what education is really about. It's not a passive thing. Ethnic studies isn't a niche studies. Ethnic studies isn't a study for minorities and minorities. It's a study of our full human, and even beyond that history, because we're all interconnected to other things beyond humanity. That's what our peoples of color, our Native people, our Indigenous people have been teaching us for eons, you know? And we're just starting to discover their wisdom because we've been told we're too stupid, you know? So anyway, I'm going to see my time now to get to other things.
Well, all I can say is amen, Sister Vicci. 1969, I was, spring of 1969, I was a high school senior getting ready to go to Duke University. I come out of a place called Greensboro, North Carolina. And I come out of a world that is comparable and parallel to the kind of thing that Vicci talked about, because the world that I grew up in, as I described for my students, was a world of late Jim Crow, which fundamentally meant that I grew up in almost a hermetically sealed Black world. And the first time I sat in a classroom with a white student was when I went to Duke. And so the kind of politics that I had very much framed by civil rights movement and Black power. When I was 8 years old, February 1st, 1960, 4 Black college students at A&T, then college, sat in at a Woolworths counter in downtown Greensboro, my hometown, and all hell broke loose. I had an idea that something was happening, but I really didn't get it. But what I came to understand over the years was that this was a big deal, because it jump-started the student wing of the Black freedom struggle, of the civil rights movement, jump-started the emergence of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and gave us sort of almost a 10-year run of amazing radical Black student activism. And so that's the world out of which I came. And so by the time by 1969, I had a lot of hair then, and I was very militant. And my introduction to the Third World Liberation Front and the Third World Strike came primarily through a bunch of radicals at Duke. They even had those at Duke. And so, people were always talking about what fellow students were doing on other campuses. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, California seemed like, might as well have been in the Far East or something. But there was a lot of interest in what was happening, not only at Berkeley, but at San Francisco State. And so there's a lot of interest among my friends at the time about what role did Black students play in what was happening at San Francisco State? What role were they playing in what was happening at Berkeley? So I didn't have this kind of immediate knowledge. What I was getting were these dribs and drabs from fellow students. And so fast forward, when I came to Berkeley in 1973, one of the things that immediately struck me was there was an ethnic studies department. And as I was coming to Berkeley, Black studies was becoming a separate department. And I had it hit me like I had no idea what this all meant. Where are the Black people going over here? Aren't we all part of it? And so, at the time I had friends who had all kinds of ideas about all of this stuff. But what I can honestly say is that several of the people who were very prominent in the politics of that moment, especially several of the Black faculty and students, I came to know very well. And the thing that really I think we also need to work with is how institutions like the schools you're a part of and Berkeley de-radicalize, they come in and they take the juice and they and so I think that's a lot of what I saw. I met a lot of people who were uber radical, but once you start dealing with the university, then you have to make compromises, you have to figure out, well, how do I work within this system? And so a lot of the work that I was also fascinated by was, and I ultimately, many decades later, came to write a book with a good friend, Josh Bloom, about the Black Panther Party, was interracial activism, cross-racial, multiracial, social justice kind of work. And so in the 70s, I was keenly aware that all kinds of fascinating things were happening. And so, but I can honestly say the things that jump out at me, getting to know very early on Ron Takaki, who at the time, I read a book, but, but he was one of those people like Harvey who helped educate me, because I did not have a very, I read a lot, so I had a textbook knowledge of a lot of stuff, but I had no experiential knowledge. And I think, that for me, coming, in the 70s, Takaki was really important. And then when I came back in the 90s, Harvey and B. Dong, a whole bunch of other people, we became good friends. And then my education around a whole range of issues just became amazing. And so I think for me, what I see about life as is sort of like a continuing opening, a kind of journey from a very, very narrow parochial world to sort of becoming more of a global citizen, trying to understand the relationship between the local and the global, and trying to think about how someone like me, it's always interesting. People say, blah, 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 professor, blah, 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 blah. I had no clue what a professor was, I think, until I went to college, right? I knew who teachers were, and teachers were very influential in my life, especially before I went to college. But, I grew up in the projects. So, and with all that we moved to a real house when I was, 13 or something like that. So a real house meaning detached home in a Black subdivision, blah, blah. And so my journey, I think, has been one of expanding horizons and I think greater understanding. And the final thing I'll say is that I love being in Berkeley because one of the things that happens is that both of my daughters, were raised here. And we have these ongoing conversations about my generation, her generation. I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, and so it was the center of my universe, right? And so I'm always trying to think about what the world will be like for her generation. But what I want to leave you with is this, every generation must make its own history. And, I always get these things, well, what did you all do? What's your advice for me? Go for it. My sense is that this notion that, I have some kind of uber knowledge because I read all these books and written these books, or have been there and done this. I can tell you what I think. It's like the Black Panther Party. You can't recreate the Black Panther Party in 2023. The historical conditions are very, very different. You will have to make your own organization that's gonna speak to this moment. But I'm always energized by the thought that young people make and continue to make history. And, high school teachers and, wherever you are in the middle, wherever you are, the thing that I mostly remember about my teachers is that, the world that I grew up in, it was a very affirmative, inspiring. I have my daughter's, this is all nostalgic. You're so naive. You and Jim Crow, the Black people over here. To be honest, a lot of the negative ways that people perceive Black people and a lot of the negativity around issues of Black identity that people assume Black people had, I can honestly say I didn't have that. I grew up in a world where white people were so peripheral that they didn't really mean a whole lot to me. I understood they had money and power, but so be it. And the love and the affirmation that came from the world out of which I was fertilized, that's what meant something to me. And so a lot of this, stuff about Black self-hate, I understand that. I have friends who have all kinds of complex ideas about Black people. But I can honestly say that, the world that I grew up in, they checked that. They checked that in the school I went to, they checked that in the Sunday school I went to, they checked that in the Boy Scouts, they checked that in the, and so, it was like, and so when we get these movements, these youth movements, these youth student movements about self-determination, about affirmation, it was like natural to me. It was like the world out of which I came. And it was so beautiful to come to see that we are all in this together. We're all struggling together.
I guess you could say that I was active in the strike. I was involved in the other social movements that were going on previous to the strike as an individual, such as Stop the Draft Week, which Vicci was also involved in, and I was also involved in Black Panther support as an individual, concerned about issues. And I even went down to the Black Panther office when it was announced that they needed people to be there because it was going to be raided. So students were really concerned. But in terms of Asian American activism, AAPA was the organization that worked to organize and pull together Asian Americans. And that was founded in April. I had joined it later in October. And one of the big appeals of it was its community focus. I was already doing tutorials with a buddy of mine from Sacramento. He had gone to community college, and I bumped into him. I asked him, "What are you doing? Since you're transferring from community college?" He says, "Well, I'm going to join the Glee Club." So I said, "Well, how about maybe we should do something more radical?" So me and him went, and we went every Wednesday to do tutoring immigrant kids in San Francisco Chinatown, and then we got familiar with the community there. We started hanging out with street youth. There was a group, Leeways, which stands for Legitimate Ways. These were street kids who wanted to form their own self-help organization. So that was like very educational for us. And then, so I guess you could say that was the atmosphere, change. You can make a choice, you can be involved. And we wanted to push that idea also, because we felt like our world was broadening, And then AAPA and some professors like Paul Takagi called a meeting about to find if there's interest in Asian American studies. And there was a series of meetings there, and we started to go into those meetings, and we met founding people in AAPA, and we started to kind of relate more and connect more around this idea of Asian American solidarity. And then AAPA was also in communications with the Afro-American Students Union, which was negotiating for Black Studies beginning, I think, April '68. They submitted their proposal, like a 24-page proposal to the chancellor's office, and the chancellor turned it over to Letters and Science, and the Letters and Science set up had it reviewed, and they said it had to go through their executive committee, but that the Afro-American Students Union cannot go to the Letters and Science executive committee meetings to provide any input, and that they'll have the final say. So extreme frustration, in terms of they had no voice. Andrew Billingsley was the professor who was assigned to help develop African American studies also, and he was not allowed to go to those executive committee meetings. And so finally the executive committee revised the proposal, rejected some key components of the student demands. One having to do with community orientation. They felt that was not relevant. Another having to do with student power, student involvement. They felt that was not the place of students. The place of students is to be at the bottom of the totem pole. So I guess Clementina talked about the Black Chicano studies also being formed, and Asian American studies negotiations just beginning, Native American studies just beginning to be pulled together. But it was the African American Student Union that proposed this idea of the coalition, and it took off fairly quickly, because I think the response from Letters and Science was January 15th, and then the strike took place 7 days later. You know, and so I definitely saw that as a life-changing experience for myself. We were still doing community work, and the strike was taking place. National Guard came. Helicopters were dropping tear gas all over the students, and students were being beaten. One student, Cordell Abercrombie, was kidnapped because he was a strike captain, and he was brought down to the police station, and he was beaten, and they made him say that he would not come out to the strike line again. And so the next day at the convocation, he said he was a big fat liar because he's out on the strike line again. You know? So that was like the spirit of the times, you know, in terms of people forming this really close solidarity, getting to know each other, repression by the governor, you know, Ronald Reagan, who was already calling for heavy clampdowns on the SF state strikers because they had gone on strike earlier, and that what we did was we actually opened a second front, you know. It took some of the heat off of the strikers at SF State, you know. So definitely that it felt like we were like in a war, and after the strike, we didn't really get what we wanted. We called a moratorium of strike activities, but the agreement was that there would be established this interim department of ethnic studies pending further negotiations for a full liberal college, you know. So that was what we wanted, but that's not what ended up, and it led to a situation where every 10 years a new generation of students would have to organize and protest for the college. 1999, 2009, 2017, there were student upheavals, contradictions according to each particular time, but looking towards a college as the solution, you know, autonomy, relevancy, you know, community. The original negotiation issues of the third world strike at Berkeley, it's still there, you know, those issues. One thing that was kind of interesting was I went to work at Self-Help for the Elderly in San Francisco, Chinatown, and that was an agency that dealt with a lot of oppression and poverty, especially among elderly Chinese, Filipino, and I think Italian, mostly immigrants and stuff. And the director, I was always wondering what he felt about the strike. And he told me that, you know, all that stuff that you guys did there, you know, creating all that ruckus and the violence and that took place, he thought that was something that's needed, you know, that type of disruption, you know. So I was really happy to hear that from my boss. Yeah, so 20 years later or so, what was it when I met you, Waldo?
Oh God, in the 90s.
Oh, 90s. Okay, that's like.
But you know what the other interesting thing was Richard Aoki.
Oh yeah.
I had met Richard in the 70s because he was, you know, Richard was this cool guy who was at all these black parties, and I'm trying to figure, who is this guy? And then I didn't know he had politics, you know? And so when I came back and we were doing something, and then Richard was there, and then I think B was taking a class with me.
With you.
And
yeah.
then, and so it all started to come together of this radical Asian American activism interwoven with Black radicalism and how all of this was working itself out. And so it's very, very, very cool. But when I was trying to put together that class on social movements of people of color, I went to be at Harvey. What should I do? And they said, you need to read this. You need to look at this. And so this was the other piece of, people like to act like professors know everything. Hell no. You know where the knowledge is, and you go to the people who know, and that's why Su Ching Chan, Ling Chi, there were all these people, Carlos Munoz, in ethnic studies who schooled me, especially when I got back in the 90s. And so I think there's this conversation that we had, that just catalyzed my understanding of the world. But I think Harvey and V were absolutely ground zero, fundamental to it, and you can see why. That kind of deep knowledge, and as the other panelists have shown to it, the history is boring because we take the people out of it.
History isn't boring. It's the people, the oppressors who make it boring.
And
They
so
don't want us to know how we actually make history, and what we've done and how we've actually the solidarity. I'm sorry. Did you guys have a second question?
I think we're gonna answer that.
Yeah, this was amazing and beautiful and just so amazing to be here with you all. So we just want to open it up to the audience and hear from you, because this is just such an amazing conversation. And if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask the whole panel or any individual.
And let me just put it out there. Vicci came to a couple of classes of mine. How did she get to a class of mine? Through Harvey. Harvey said, if you're gonna have somebody talk, bring in Vicci. And it was like, over the years, he was my go-to person, because he knows everybody and knows everything. And so, not everything. But I think we need to honor that knowledge. We need to respect that knowledge. And I really appreciate what what you were saying about, coming out of a farm worker kind of, because in my world, the thing that really got me was when I was at Duke, and they actually had the grapes, I love me some grapes. And then all of a sudden, we having a strike, it's a strike. And so, it opens your world. I mean, even in, Durham, North Carolina, it opened my world, and it rocked it in a lot of ways. Because I had, family members who, picked cotton and tobacco mostly and stuff like that. So I knew that world. But
I asked this question to the panel in general. What do you hope high school students are getting out of an ethnic studies course that they're not going to have mandated towards their graduation?
I'll just throw off, some of the key concepts. Once again, a connection. Like I'm hoping, I've heard presentations about ethnic studies curriculum today, but I'm not really real knowledgeable about it. So I would say, I hope there's connection after connection after connection that are made for the students. Everything from their own history, their own community, to how it's similar to the other struggles that are going on, not only people of color, but also other struggles that we see today, be it transgender issues or whatever. So the kids start seeing, as I think we've all referred to, is the connection that's so important that we all make with one another, and that is something that needs to be there for our kids. Even our high schoolers are so isolated, throughout the years, right? And how do you bring them back? How do you make them feel part of a larger community? And so I think ethnic studies absolutely needs to do that. And at the same time, the kids need to learn about allies, you know, and it's not just about looking in the mirror and who they are, but who are all their allies. And once again, those are connections, right, that are made for them, that you as teachers can help the kids to make. And then they can do research on it, you know, projects, whatever, to go further into that. So I think those two are key.
And beyond that, the other thing is, what is it all about? What was the strike about? Why did we have to organize? It's a question. Politics is a question of power. Power. And I didn't get time because I can easily go on to millions of tangents. But the part when I was saying I grew up in a black and white world, that was it. It was actually made in white. And then when black power became the thing, I understood it immediately. We were one of the last to get a TV, but as soon as we got one, I was riveted to the news. I mean, I couldn't believe there were teenagers, a little bit older than me, because I was about like 11 or 12 then at the time when the civil rights movement began. But I knew immediately why those teens were out there, you know, trying to. I mean, I couldn't understand why our lunch counter is only for whites only. Why our restaurants for whites only? Why can't other students go to school? Why are there schools for only whites? You know, what you were talking about, what Waldo grew up in. We didn't have that so outwardly in the Bay Area or in Salinas where I grew up. But on the other hand, hey, I knew what discrimination was. I didn't know how to say the word, but I knew what it was. I knew what racism was. I didn't, I couldn't explain to you institutional racism or capitalism or anything at that time, but I knew what that was. I knew what it was to be oppressed. I knew what it was to be exploited. I knew what it was to be kept down. I just didn't know what to do about it, the way out, I just knew there was a certain point for me, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I didn't understand how my parents could take it, and other people around me could take it, so I just felt like, okay, I gotta do something, so that's why I organized Farmworkers Union, even though I couldn't speak Spanish, even though I didn't have a car. I just tried to find a way to deal with it, and at that time, I became a movement brat, because you start understanding everything is intertwined, interconnected. And my high school teacher talked about, hey, we got to learn about this place called Vietnam. What the? Vietnam? What? Nobody heard about this in the 1960s, Who knew what's Vietnam? And he was the first to bring that up to us. He trusted us 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds to know that that we weren't dumb, that we could understand what was happening, what our government was trying to do and drag us into a war, because who was going to be fighting that war? It was people of color mainly. My brothers and my brother-in-law all fought in Vietnam, and all of the people I know who went ended up turning against it. But anyway, I was also close to, Salinas is close to Fort Ord, at that time the largest army base in Seaside. That was the shipping point where all the soldiers went to go to Vietnam. So I started getting involved in that and the anti-draft movement and the anti-war movement, because I saw immediately it's all connected. The Farmworkers is connected. And you have to understand at that time, even the leftist movement was very divided on all this stuff. Martin Luther King, when he spoke out against the war, that was very unpopular. Most of the civil rights people told him, don't do it. Don't keep it now, keep it among civil rights. That way we won't turn off, the liberal whites, and we just, don't get involved in the war. That's too political. That's too radical. But to Martin Luther King's credit, he went out anyway and he spoke out against the war. Again, that was not a popular thing. Now you have Malcolm X coming out. You got SNCC, Stokely Carmichael with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee talking about Black Power. Black power. We're not going to turn the other cheek. I'm sorry, Martin Luther King, but we're just not going to get beaten anymore. And I, as a young kid, as much as I love Martin Luther King, I identified with that. How can I turn my other cheek? So hitting me on the head, I'm going to hit him back. I was like all for what, and Malcolm X, he blew my mind. I couldn't believe there was something. I wanted to be black. There was no Asian American at that time, even Chinese. We were a minority of a minority of a minority. Altogether, we were less than 1% of the population back then. We had, talk about power, I mean, there was nothing. I mean, just, so when I came, as soon as I heard about the Black Panthers, man, I was all for him. I came to Oakland, I tried to join the Black Panther Party. They told me no. I said, why? I looked in the mirror. I said, oh. And I kept asking my parents, are you sure I'm not adopted? I have some black blood in me, you know, or Native American blood. No, you're Chinese. You know, oh man, I was so disappointed. And so, and then this is what they told me. They said, find your own group. What is my group? I'm not white, I'm not black. That was the only thing going on in the world at that time. Even among the movement left. We, people of color, we were activists. There were plenty of us in the movement, in the anti-war movement, start the draft movement, you know, but we had no place except in, you know, the followers, people doing the mimeograph. You know, you talking about the rank and file type marchers, you know. And so finally, I get a call, because it is important. How many of you know how the Asian American movement started? I think it's the least known national movement probably in this country. Because I don't think most people know how it started. There wasn't, you know, the Asian American movement came up with the term and concept of Asian American, extremely important. And it was based on and unlike what I'm sorry, most ethnic studies and even Asian American studies texts tell you, it was not born of a moderate middle class movement or mentality or different from the other national movements. No, it was right in line. It was on the heels of radical anti-imperialist thought, supporting Black power, and that, you know, very important to understand. It was not, we could have formed the Asian American Mahjong Society. Or the Pickleball Society to keep the opera part of it. No, we formed the Asian American political life. The Asian American is, of course, you know, the attention getter, but political alliance. That was the other key thing. Because up to that point, it had never happened before. I grew up, most of my friends, Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese, because those are the predominant Asian nationalities at that time, and later Koreans and Vietnamese, other Asians, you know, started coming more into this country. But at that time, they were the predominant groups of Asians. But I never saw that consciously as Asian. Hey, we're an Asian American group, you know? No, I just saw, hey, you know, we're friends, but I didn't understand why we even had this, you know, immediate affinity with each other. Or why when I crossed the street, you know, and a car tried to run me over and go back to Vietnam, you gook, or I'd be called Yoko Ono. I never understood this, you know. If you're gonna call me a pejorative, can you please call me the right one? You know, it was crazy, you know. I didn't know what I was. And then, you know, so suddenly I get this call from a woman who says, you know, hey, we're gonna try to form an Oriental group of the Peace and Freedom Party, a caucus. And yeah, well, this is intriguing, you know, but this is kind of like, I just kind of knew there's something to this, there's something. So I go to the place, there's only 6 people show up, including the 2 hosts, UG, Joke, and Emma G. And UG was the one who came, he was a grad student at Berkeley, and we met at a house, purposely, again, we're not founded as a student group. You know, it was purposely and consciously formed as a national grassroots organization, and we did not want to be just a student group. We didn't want to just be a local Berkeley group. We've decided, as soon as he said, you know, I've been thinking, I think we should all be called Asian American. Fireworks. Everything but the sex came. You know, because the 6 of us in that living room sitting like right here. That's it. That's why it made perfect sense why I was being called all these names. This is how the rest of America saw us. They saw me as a Japanese or Filipino. And why my parents would take us to these movies, no matter who was playing what, just to see ourselves, somebody who looked. This is the way we were treated in this country. Asians in Asia laughed at us when they first heard, what are you? We're not a minority in China or in Japan. We have no identity problem. But now, you know, we had big identity problems here. We had no identity. minority, being the invisible minority, being the model minority, that they would trot out like an Oriental rug, to be walked on, when they wanted to showcase us as being the silent, model minority who followed all the rules, but then they would roll us back up, and put us in the warehouse when they, didn't want us around. So, that was what we were. And so when we came out, and we were just part of the same thing. We were in that vein. How dare they insult our struggle, our people, saying that we are different from the other minorities. No, we're not. We came out of that same vein of proudly identifying with the Black Power struggle. We really do owe the Black Power struggle. All the minorities in this country, and to identify with that. And then the Thorough Liberation Front. Liberation, that is the goal. That is our goal. That is the goal of ethnic studies. It's not just to be ethnic. Who wants to be ethnic? No, we want liberation. That's what we want. And there's a way we want to know how to get it. How do we have to organize to get it. Exactly what Clementina's talking about, solidarity. And it's not based on fake idealism. No, because if we really taught ethnic studies the way we wanted it to be taught in college, maybe we wouldn't have to have a Stop AAPI hate right now. Maybe we wouldn't have to have a Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter right now, if they had implemented what we had demanded over 54 years ago, because your math is bad. Because the man that was educating you, that's an indictment of the man's education. We can't even add. So how can we govern ourselves, right? How can we govern ourselves if we kept in the dot like this? And then they want to say, again, we're too stupid, and you guys are among the first, second generation of scholars. I mean, this is what they said after I was talking about the history of when our department was formed. They said, you guys, but we don't have since there's no discipline, since there's no curriculum, this is new, we still have to tell you what to do. We white Western academics have to tell you what should be in your curriculum. To this day, they're telling us, and it's even worse. We're now being dictated about what ethnic studies should be by, talk about a minority, Zionists. Most Jews are not Zionists. The Zionists are now attacking our model curriculum because they don't want to include Palestinians or Arab Americans or what we saw now West Asians, because we're constantly in flux, we're more inclusive. I mean, ethnic studies has not become, just as we envisioned it. We didn't have a narrow vision of what ethnic studies or even Asian American studies should be. We based it on what was happening at the time. And we even said in our programs that it's a fluid, fluctuating thing and should be according to what is in the times. So that's now why we have gender studies. That's why now it's included Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and other. I mean, we have to be, like Waldo was talking about, according to the times. It shouldn't be a static, rigid thing. It should be evolving, but it's got to be evolving based on the reality. And again, if you have any other studies, when they have to do a curriculum about physics or anthropology or biology or chemistry or even Darwin, Darwin or anything else in English, they assemble a group of so-called, the best experts from that field to develop their curriculum. Why is it only ethnic studies? The people who get to dictate what we're being taught to us are the people who least know and have the least interest in us knowing about our country. Zionists and whites, academics. It's the only field of study, the only discipline that is still being dictated to outside the people. We now have a certain body of ethnic studies, academics like Waldo. Why isn't he on the committee?
I'm in solidarity with you.
Not because you don't want it. I'm just talking about, and then our Salinas governor, he vetoed the one last year. Why? Because a few Zionists objected to the inclusion of Palestinians. That was the main reason. It's the main reason.
Vicci, if I could add a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is, there's more people of color out there in powers of position. You've seen them superintendents, everywhere from superintendents, principals. our state superintendent of education, and yet people's politics aren't always as progressive, and I don't really even like that word, but committed to our communities, and certainly the politicians sell out. There's no question about it, because that's what politicians are about. I mean, they do make compromise, and I see that as a sellout, right? I mean, and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's staying true to the community. And I would want to just add one more responsibility to your plates, because which is that, as Vicci had referred about the curriculum, it really, ethnic studies and the bigger concept of it really does need to start in TK and kindergarten. You know, you would have easier jobs, right, at the high school level if the kids came in and had a better sense of who they are, where they came from, the respect and the honor that goes to their communities, you know, so that they know who they are. So I would say your teachers, you have influence. Whether you think so or not, I swear, teachers are one of the most powerful groups that I know of that can make changes, because you have the kids in front of you, and they are the next generation. They're the next decision makers, and you have your role to play in educating them. So I think if you could add one more thing to your plate, which is really be articulate in trying to move education forward, beginning with the TK and the K2B, you know, move it out of ethnic studies, because that's a pretty inclusive term, and it needs to be more inclusive. But I think we just all need to do more work today, and I think it's harder today because of the social media out there and the pressure that you get. What Vicci's referring to, I don't know if any of you were involved with the ethnic studies thing at the state level, but it was ugly and it was sad. And the decision was a watered down ethnic studies curriculum. Now, I know for a fact that teachers say yes to the administrators, and then they close their doors, and you do whatever you want, basically. Okay, and that's good. I mean, this
as long as you're not in Florida.
Yeah, good point. Well, no, they're fighting there too.
You know, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But you know, that's the thing, that you are so instrumental in the future. So and the other thing is make the connections with other teachers and organizations. I know Oakland, I was in a Zoom meeting with Oakland teachers that are moving to develop the curriculum. So if we need to have more connections with everybody who's doing the curriculum, because we don't want to work on a deficit model, which is, especially for the little ones, which is how do we fix up History Alive that they're doing in 4th, 5th grade today? And I don't know if there's somebody from that organization here, but we're always trying to fix the curriculum as opposed to starting with what we know and what certainly has come out of ethnic studies for the last 54 years. So you know what I mean? But that's, you have a tremendous key role to play with your students and for the future. So any way that those of us that are out, retired or whatever, hanging out, we're happy to help you.
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes, so probably one more question.
First of all, thank you all so much for being here. It's really an honor. So I'm still trying to formulate the question in my mind, but sometimes I get into arguments with friends where, especially when we see the increase of violence that we're seeing in our society today, and I wonder, because sometimes I say like, oh, white people do have souls, and then my friend's like, no, they don't, and it's like, and so how do we, like, when do we know, like, how to, like, when to be truculent and to be ready to engage and to protest, and then how do we know when to be diplomatic? Like, how does the strategy change depending on like what type of situation that we're in? Like, also, like, as we're teaching ethnic studies, how do we also come from a position of not trying to just constantly, excuse my language, but shit on white people all the time and like make them feel attacked? Like, how do we say, like, friend, how do I take you by the hand and help you see the way that I'm seeing things? But a lot of people will also disagree and say no, like we have to like make our point heard. And so like how does those strategies?
So it seems like you really have to focus on history in institutions and how ideas develop, and how ideologies develop in society, the history of racism, the roots of it, and that it's an ideology that needs to be tackled. White people are particularly have a key role in that. I think even if you look at the civil rights movement and how that evolved, it wasn't just Black people fighting for Black people, but it was a movement actually, like what Vicci was saying, liberation, human rights. And the other thing is how to ground ideas and concepts. You have to really base it on the experience of the students that are in your classes, their life experience, their family experience. And from there, have them come to that understanding of how people are interconnected, because we just kind of start off something really high up there, they're not going to relate to it. But if you talk about, what are some of the local issues and problems that affect the community, the environment, race relations, and there look for learning points, and that would make a big difference, I would say. Yeah.
I think it's really tough, your question, because over and over I have seen it's hard to give up your privilege. It's hard to give up power. And for many white people, that's basically where it is. And I've just seen it too many times with progressives, with white women, all across the spectrum. It always ends up being self-interest. And what is that self-interest? And I think the thing is, at some point, you need to make the connections. That's the only thing. What impacts on you, on me, also impacts on you. And people have to understand that. And it goes beyond the intellectual understanding, but some emotional. And that's why, honestly, one of the hopes I see is that more and more, certainly here in Albany, a third of the kids are, maybe even more, are kids of mixed race, and those are the kids that I think hopefully from their families, beginning in the home and then at schools, will start understanding, hey, there's all kinds of connections for me to make, right? And that'll, I think, is where we need to move, because when you're isolated, when you're by yourself, all you think about is what's best for me, what's best for my community. And you forget about, other people and how to work with other people. And so I think that's the issue. Nobody hands over their power easily. We saw that at ethnic studies at the state level. Today, you still see it all over the place. So it's tough, and it's day to day. And it's what you as teachers can do as role models. And you know who your allies are in your schools, right? They're not your same ethnicity. You may not even have lunch with them, but you know who to connect to on different issues.
And I would say that, again, when talking about power is never given. It's always taken. I wish it could be peaceful. I wish Martin Luther King was right in that sense. But that's not what our history has proven us. Every right has been over the bodies, over dead bodies. Because our strike was the bloodiest and longest in UC history. Not because, Harvey was everybody, then it was strike at Berkeley. Everyone, it was violent strike. Okay, but what was the violence? Because those in power are violently opposed to our freedom, to our liberation. They want to keep us oppressed. And so, even if people don't understand that intellectually, I think most people on the street understand that when they talk about the man keeping us down, and it's just more like, I really can't do much about it, because that's the way it's always been. So we just kind of make your own individual peace with it. But anyway, to your question, I think what Clementina, it's so, what you're facing now, I don't even know how I would be able to deal with that in terms of the social media and instant feedback and all this negative, on parents and all this. All it takes is, I was going to Zoom school board meetings around passing with Clementina about passing the original model curriculum. And you know what? Actually, the majority at first approved it. But it was all it took was one dissenting voice, one pro-Zionist person, sometimes not even a parent in that school district, but just some outsider of a Zionist group to say, hey, we think this is anti-Semitic because they've been able to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitic. And if you really examine and you know the truth of the term, that's not true at all. But they've managed to do that. That's now the president, Biden, all these Muslims, they all repeat that. The anti-Zionism is being anti-Semitic. Okay, I'm not going to get into a big thing about that right now because I want to really talk about the real problems that you guys are facing and will be continue to face. And then in terms of how you know when to fight back and sometimes, how to, because Clementina is right. We have to deal with reality. We have to deal with what the city. So I'm not saying, even though I think it's a sellout and I don't like what they came up with in this new thing, and I wish we had the original, I think says curriculum, it's still a start. It's just like what we have happened to Waldo College. It's still not there. It's like maybe a sliver of what we had hoped the Waldo College would be, But on the other hand, you got to work with what you have. It still was a victory, and so you try to make the best of it, and you work within, what you have, but you also work without. You keep trying to stretch the parameters of the freedom that you have within the system. We used to say in the 60s, because of the Vietnam War and the identification of the U.S. as being the greatest superpower ever and the greatest imperialist power since the Roman Empire, which it has modeled itself on. Okay, we were in the belly of the beast. Those of us fighting U.S. imperialism saw ourselves as having an even greater obligation because we were in the belly of the beast. Whereas the Vietnamese and other people who were fighting and kicking the U.S. imperialists out of their countries, in some ways we had the harder job because we were inside. We were inside the beast. But we also felt a greater obligation, just like, okay, those of us who went to UC Berkeley, that's considered to this day the cream of the crop of public universities and of the UC system. So in many ways, we felt we had a greater obligation to fight because things that happen in national education, a lot of it emanates from UC Berkeley. We are considered, UC Berkeley's education department is vaunted, right, and copied around the world. So we found an even greater obligation of fighting for the World College and of fighting against this administration because we saw it wasn't just going to affect what was happening to Berkeley students or even UC students, but the whole educational system worldwide. So this is how we also had that internationalist outlook and everything that we did, that we didn't just see what we were fighting for. Yeah, you start with that that's natural, that's fine. Okay, I'm just here in my school, in my classroom, and just fighting this one thing. But you see the ripples, it ripples out. It's like every act, even people who say they're not political or they're not doing that, how you treat somebody. If you're kind to them, if your waiter puts down your meal, how do you act to them? These are the starts. We want to build a society to avoid, because I struggle with this all the time. How do we avoid the pitfalls of what has happened to so many revolutions that started out with good ideas and ended up oppressing their people, becoming the opposite? And the thing is that, you have to start living the revolution you want. You can't put that back, and say, okay, right now we're going to have proletarian and this and that, or parties and discipline, and we're going to, that's for later. Right now we have to have this order. I understand in certain things, just like in the military, you have to have discipline, just like we had in the strike. We had a chain of command and order because we realized we had to have that. But, on the other hand, we were always trying to promote democracy, collectivism, small groups, affinity groups, connection. And again, we taught the kind of things. Well, how do most people here, why don't we know? Why don't we know that Chinese and Irish railroad workers joined together in strikes against the, greedy, ruthless railroad moguls? Why don't we know that? Why don't we know that Asian Americans had the largest contingent supporting the Black Panther Party in the 60s. Because now when you hear about Black Lives Matter or something, you hear about, a lot of the divisions and come from, oh, you guys didn't support us, why should we support you? Who does that benefit? We always have to ask, who does that benefit whenever we're kept from each other, when we're kept from supporting each other, or just being told to stay in our own little narrow, groups or interests because, they never supported you, so why should we support, And even if that were true, that still doesn't mean you should do that. But the fact of the matter is, it's not true. We have all fought for and helped, there are other instances, really ugly instances where we didn't. But we also, there are those instances. So this, also critics, people of color parents who criticize ethnic studies and say that we're just teaching victimization type of thing. I don't know if you've heard that too. Saying, you guys are just teaching that we're being victims. You should be more positive and talk about the good examples, And hey, what's a better example than Chinese and Irish workers joining together? That's pretty positive, in the face of some really bad shit. But we don't know that.